Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class, Urban Sketching Tips and Tricks. I am your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and this is going to be a very cursory class for urban sketching. So if you're new to urban sketching, I'm going to give you just a lot of really easy tips and tricks, just like the title of the class says. And if you would like more information on urban sketching, you can refer back to some other classes that I have done with Michaels that can be found on the Michaels website under Fine Art videos or on YouTube by searching urban sketching, and you'll say just dropped several links to other classes on YouTube in the chat. So if you want to copy and paste those somewhere else real quick and save them for later, you can. And if you're watching later on YouTube, you can search urban sketching and my name, Adrienne Hodge, or you can search perspective drawing. Those are the other links that we just included were some other classes on 1-point perspective studies was one of the class names, 2-point perspective studies, 3-point perspective studies, just perspective studies was another class, and then a couple of classes on urban sketching that we did using watercolor markers and pen and ink from a couple of years ago. So I've been doing these classes for 3 years, and there are tons of classes that you can find on drawing and painting with me if you like my teaching style through the Michaels website under Fine Art, or like I said, searching on YouTube for my name and keywords of classes. Okay, so, and then since this is going to be such a cursory class and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail when it comes to honestly any of the topics that we're going to discuss tonight, it's going to be very quick little tips and tricks that anybody can do wherever you are in your urban sketching practice. But if you are wanting more on watercolor techniques, you're in luck, because in September, I've got a class coming up where I'm going to be covering watercolor techniques. So stay tuned for that in September. And here are some examples of just some fun watercolor techniques that we'll be doing in that class. And you can find the sign up for that class the same place that you signed up for this one on the Michaels website. And then after that class, we'll be doing a class on painting a purple passion flower. And there's also a class on drawing a purple passion flower. So a little class that will break down the fundamentals of that particular flower to gear up for drawing. So we'll have the watercolor techniques class, and then the class on drawing and painting the purple passion flower. That's coming up in September. And there'll be a little 2-week break, or this is the last class that I'll have for August, because just the way we worked it out in July and August. So I've only got 2 classes in August, and then those classes will be coming up in September. Okay, I'm going to switch to my tabletop view and go over supplies, and we'll get started here. Don't forget to tag your work with the hashtags Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes. And you can follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art. And here are some of my business cards with some of my work on them. I'm also on Facebook, Adrienne Hodge Fine Art. Okay, so we are using Artist Loft supplies in tonight's class, and I have a block of Artist Loft watercolor paper, which I just realized I forgot to pull out on my desk because I was getting all my other supplies ready tonight. So let me grab that real quick. I'm going to grab it in just a second. I'm going to keep talking about the rest of the supplies, and then I'll just take a moment to grab that. We've got the Artist Loft illustration pens here. So a set of those, or any drawing pens that are permanent and waterproof. So the Artist Loft illustration pens, I think they say waterproof on them. They say, no, they do not say that they are, but they definitely are and can handle having some water splashed onto them. So we're going to be drawing first in with the pen and ink, and you'll find out really quickly if your pens are not waterproof because they will just bleed a little bit whenever you add some watercolor to them. I'm gonna zoom out a little bit here with my camera. Okay, and then I have a set of Artist Loft watercolors, and I have some Artist Loft sketching pencils. You might do a little bit of sketching first in pencil if you're not comfortable jumping in with the pens first, but I am going to be doing some pen only stuff. So hopefully that's not scary to anyone. And then I put Artist Loft paintbrushes on the supply list, but I happen to leave those in the classroom that I've been teaching in right now. So I'm using a few other paintbrushes here, but as long as you have a flat brush, some medium round brushes, and then a liner brush, which those brushes will come in the set of Artist Loft watercolor brushes, the Aquarelle, I believe is the name of those Artist Loft brushes. I could be getting the name wrong, but the watercolor brushes that were on the supply list, that's what you're going to want. And then couple of water cups, which I have here. At least one, maybe two water cups for your watercolors. And some tape could be optional. And then a couple of paper towels. I've got these shop towels here. And then I believe I put this on the supply list to grab this. And if I didn't, then take a moment to find maybe like a deck of playing cards or some kind of cards, like some business cards or Post-it notes, something like that. We're going to be using those to trace and create some little thumbnails here. Okay, so while you grab anything that you might need from the supply list, I'm going to grab my watercolor block, which is under a stack of sketchbooks behind me. So give me just one moment. Okay, so this is the Artist Loft watercolor pad that I have here with watercolor paper. Okay, so for those of you who are brand new to urban sketching is basically like on plein air sketching, which if you know what plein air sketching is, it's basically just out in the open air. So sketching outdoors. And since we are on Zoom and we can't necessarily go outdoors and sketch together, one more thing from the supply list that I included for you was these photos on urban sketching, well, with some images called Urban Sketching Tips and Tricks reference images. That was the PDF that was included on the supply list. And these are all photographs that I took at the Contemporary Austin at Laguna Gloria, where I teach in-person classes. And I actually have an in-person urban sketching workshop, which is a 10-hour weekend workshop that I've been doing up there recently. So I went around the grounds and I took a lot of photographs that I included for you. So you've got lots of wonderful photographs to use here. And I'll be scrolling through these and talking about one of my tips and tricks in just a moment. But ideally, if you were to do some traditional urban sketching, you would go out into the world and you would park yourself in a comfortable spot where you could sit for maybe 20 minutes to an hour, and you would do some sketching, and you could bring all of these supplies with you. You could have pens, you could have watercolor paper, you could have a small set of watercolors, or, you know, all of these things could fit in a small bag that we have here. And yeah, I included a lot of images. I'm scrolling through, I'm like, wow, that was a lot of images that I shared with you all here. So, but there's a lot to choose from, and you'll kind of choose based on what your skill level is. And I'll tell you what to do if your skill level is very beginner, then you don't need to worry. I've got some tricks that are going to help us all. So I see Cindy is saying we do go out and do plein air painting, but I find it takes me forever to sketch out my ideas. Okay, great. Is it similar to background drawing or different? So I found a few different definitions of urban sketching online, and the one that I like basically just it's the only difference between plein air and urban sketching. I would say the definitions that I've seen online are that it's a little more open-ended. You can take things back. I mean, there's really no rules when it comes to art. It's just what can we call these, use these more traditional terms. And a lot of urban sketchers add their color later back at their desk, or maybe a hotel room if you're doing it while traveling, or you can do the watercolor out while you're sitting there. So the other tips that I'm going to be sharing tonight, so I'm going to share tips for sketching and tips for editing and creating compositions, tips for loosening up, and also the watercolor tips to keep it nice and loose and playful. And a lot of urban sketching is very loose and playful. You don't have to feel like you have to finish anything. Finished is a relative term. You can leave things open. You can leave gaps in between your watercolor. So those are the things that I'm going to share with you, just things that'll help you be able to do this in a short period of time, so that you can take this practice with you and do it on the go and not feel like pressure to complete it or make it, I don't know, fill in the blank with whatever we feel like it needs to be or it should be. Okay, so I'm just reading through these questions to see if there are any that I should address. Okay, that's great. Janet said she just participated in a plein air festival in Dexter, Michigan this week. That's awesome. Okay, so let's get started here. I'm gonna take out my watercolor paper, and we're gonna actually, before we do that, let's do a few preliminary things. But not too many, because like I said, I've got those other classes that you can refer back to that go over a lot of this stuff. So I don't want this to be a repeat of those other things. I want to build on it, and I want to give you some easy tips and tricks, like I said, but it's always so hard when to stick to that plan sometimes when I feel like I want to give you everything I could possibly give you to help you with the practice. So we'll be relying on these value shading techniques. If these are new to you, then you can search on YouTube for the term value shading techniques. We've had tons of classes using these. So we've got hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling. The one that I want to focus on the most is scribbling. And so the first thing that we're going to do is some little thumbnail sketches just to warm up and to practice. So I'm going to have you take your, you could do this on your watercolor paper if you wanted, or you can grab a sketchbook. I've got my Artist Loft sketchbook here, so I might do some preliminary sketching in my sketchbook first with you all, and you might want to do the same. Oh dear, I grabbed an older one that doesn't have a lot of blank pages. Here we go. Okay, so let's take our Post-it notes or the cards that you grabbed. I've got these fun tarot cards here that have a nice shape to them. And this is a little trick that I learned from another, some of this. I have too many things on my desk. This is a trick that I learned from a fellow art teacher who I teach with at Laguna Gloria, named Jenny Granberry, and she's got a lot of classes on YouTube as well. And she has a really lovely sketchbook practice, and I've mentioned this before. I just always like to give her credit for this little trick of to create a layout in your sketchbook, you can take a Post-it or maybe a couple of Post-its and a couple of interesting shaped cards like business cards, or I have this this tarot card here. So it's got an interesting shape. And we're just going to take one of our pens. I've got my smallest nib pen here, and we're going to trace the shape of our Post-it. You can do it in pencil first if you're more comfortable doing that. And we're just going to let these boxes be a little wonky. They don't have to be perfect, although I am trying to line them up next to each other nicely. But as I'm tracing them, if my lines are a little wonky, I'm embracing that. I'm still going to get a nice little frame for my thumbnail here. Do this long skinny rectangle from the tarot card. So yeah, having a few different shaped cards to trace will help you get a nice little layout. And so one just little tip and trick here for composition and layout on your sketchbook is don't feel like you have to stay within the parameters of these boxes that you drew. So in this example, I drew all these different shaped boxes, and then I went outside of my box with one of my sketches and I labeled it Contemporary Austin, Laguna Gloria. So I've got these fun sketches going on behind the layout that I made, and that's going to create an interesting composition just like that. You can also add some text. So I'm just going to write. You can also add fun text to your layout. And having that text on there is going to also add to the layout and the composition that you're creating. Because I don't know about y'all, but having a satisfying page in my sketchbook is what I'm all about. Having a page that just feels nice and fun and aesthetically pleasing. It really hits the spot in a lot of ways, makes me feel like I did what I came there to do that day when I made some art. So that is one little tool to put in your tool belt right there, actually a couple of different tools. Okay, and then inside of these, just as we sketch here and get warmed up, I want us to do, we could do this as many times as we need. So if you're like, oh, I really love this layout that I just created and I don't want to ruin it with a warm up, then save this for something else. But I'm going to use this to do some blind contour sketches just to warm up. So that's where we are not going to look at our paper. We are going to just look at the reference images that we're drawing. So I'm going to pull up a couple of examples here that I have from doing this exercise recently. So I didn't use the card to draw these thumbnails, but these are all my blind contours where I'm not looking at my paper. I'm only looking at the reference. So I'm letting it be nice and loose. And the idea is that we're going to loosen up this way. And you use whatever pen nib you are most comfortable with. People always want to know what pen I'm using. I'm going to use a little bit of a thicker nib here than the small one that I drew the boxes with, just so that I get some nice bold lines that are going to stand out. So I've got the 0.5. But the wonderful thing about making art is that everybody is going to want different materials for different reasons, and always using the same exact material that I'm using might not suit you. So try some different nibs out and see what you feel most comfortable with for this exercise. If you want to start with the same one as me, but then switch to a smaller one because you don't want really bold marks. Sometimes I want lines to show up more on Zoom just because they don't if I draw with lighter materials. So I'm always going to lean towards heavier materials when I'm teaching on Zoom. Okay, so let's look at just really any of these. We're not going to talk about the perspective just yet. I just want us to loosen up here. So we're going to focus on the light. So if you've been taking lots of classes with me, you hear me talk about the value shapes a lot, the shapes of the shadows and the shapes of the light. And all of these photographs were taken at about 5 or 6 in the evening, and there was lots of late afternoon sunlight. So there's lots of heavy shadows falling across the grass and lots of fun shapes of light as well, like the sun coming through. So look at these light shapes. And then the other thing I want you to look for is we're not worried about the perspective yet, because I just don't want us to get too overwhelmed with the perspective. I'm afraid that if I go too deeply in that, I just don't have the time. And I've done several classes on that previously that you can look up if you're struggling with it. But I want you to look for strong vertical lines. So I'm taking my pen or my pencil right now and just holding it up, making a vertical line. So vertical goes up and down, and horizontal is side to side. And then we've got these diagonal lines or these orthogonal lines, which if that's a new statement, a new vocabulary word for you, you can check out those other classes on linear perspective that I was referencing. I even have a class on basic linear perspective that draws boxes in 1, 2, and 3-point perspective from a couple years ago, maybe even from early on, 3 years ago in my teaching of these classes for Michael's. So yeah, but I want you to just look for these strong vertical lines. Where are the horizontal lines? Where are the diagonal lines? And note where those are. Note those lines, and then where there might be multiples of those lines, and then also the light shapes. So that's what I want you to be looking for when you're drawing without looking at your paper. So this is just an exercise to warm up. Okay, so pick whichever of these photographs is calling to you, and just gonna set a timer for 1 minute here. And we're just gonna sketch those lines without looking at our paper. So try to keep it continuous. Try to keep it kind of scribbly. And try not to look at your drawing paper. So the whole idea is that we're getting this direct communication between our drawing hand and our eyes. So we're looking. Okay, and yeah, it might go outside of your box. That was not quite a minute. If you look down at your paper, you will certainly get distracted. And I made the mistake of glancing over there and it's like, got distracted. Okay, so don't worry about going outside of your box. This is really just a warm up, and we're just doing it on, I'm just doing it to save time here on this layout here. So I'm gonna set another minute on the clock, and I'm gonna try to slow down a little bit more this time. I'm looking at another photo. I'm going very slowly this time. I'm looking for those strong horizontal line shapes, the big light shapes, what verticals are sticking out to me. Maybe some shapes of leaves on the trees. So we're just warming up our eyes. We're warming up looking, and we are warming up our muscles in our hands and arm. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be perfect. And I glanced down again, and we still got 10 seconds left. Okay, last one. I'll let that 10 seconds go by. So I see someone's asking, where can I find the pictures? They were included on the supply list. If you're watching later on YouTube and you're wondering where to find the pictures, they're always included with the supply list under where it says see more underneath the YouTube video. But if you're joining us from the class, you'll say just dropped it in the chat for you. Okay, so let's do one more of these here, whichever one you want. And we're going very slowly, looking at the light, looking at these little echinacea flowers here. And the other thing, the benefit of doing this with our pen is that we're getting used to the idea that a pen can be a tool for loose, carefree sketching. We don't need everything that we do with a pen to be perfect. And in fact, when we do this loose, carefree sketching, sometimes we get something to happen like I'm not really looking at my timer anymore. I've turned it off, but I just want you to make sure you're going slowly. That's why the minute, because if I don't set that minute, sometimes people go really fast and rush through these photos. But if you really slow down, I think you'll find that you might get a quality of line that is maybe more interesting and loose and carefree than you would if you were to go too fast or if you were looking. So that's a good warm up for when let's say you only have 30 minutes on your lunch break and you're not eating and you want to do a little urban sketching and you sketch a little post-it note shape, you do some blind contours to warm up, and then now you're ready to do some sketches that you might splash some watercolor into. Okay, so let's take our watercolor paper. We're going to do the same thing. Gonna make a little layout here. And as I already said, if you feel like there's a lot of information missing from this class, I've had lots of classes on these topics before, so this is meant to be like a little pocketbook guide or Cliff's Notes version of what anybody can do to enjoy an urban sketching practice. And the main idea here is that we are embracing imperfection. We are embracing the wonkiness of whatever happens, and we're not holding ourselves to some, specific product. Because oftentimes that can keep us from not making any art at all. Okay, so let me do a couple of these bigger ones. Let's take up a little more space on my paper here. I'm going to go portrait and landscape. With these, and I'm using my smaller nib pen again. I get some center lines and I'm letting them be a little wonky, and I'm also leaving some extra background space. So maybe I can fill that in with some text or with another fun sketch in the background here. Okay, so now for those of you who are beginners and are worried about the linear perspective here, this is what you should do. So if you're drawing out in the world, and let's say you come upon a building like this, like the beautiful villa at Laguna Gloria here in Austin, if I'm facing the corner of this building, what I'm seeing is 2-point perspective here. and you can look up the class on 2-point perspective studies to get a very step-by-step breakdown of how to draw 2-point perspective using an image like this. You could print out this image and use it to do the 2-point perspective studies class that is on YouTube and that we dropped in the chat earlier for you. Or let's say you were looking down the center of like this one that I was just looking at. This would be 1-point perspective. So because we're standing in the center of this little aisle here, there appears to be one vanishing point, but since we're looking at the corner of the building here, there appears to be 2 vanishing points. And again, you can check out those other classes if that's new to you. And if you're like, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming, I don't know what you're talking about when it comes to 1-point, 2-point, or 3-point perspective, then what you're going to do is choose a photograph like this. So I'm facing one side of the building here, or I'm facing, like, let's say the front of a building, or you're facing the front of a house, or you're facing the front of a structure. Then what's happening here is we've taken out a lot of the linear perspective. Yes, there is still some 2-point perspective happening over here on this little wall. There's definitely some 1-point perspective happening on these railings for the little stairs. There's some other perspective happening over here. All that means is that there is a point of view of the viewer that is making these geometric forms be skewed in a way that creates this optical illusion that we call linear perspective. But if we're facing the front like this, it really takes a lot of it out. So things are appearing as they actually are when we're looking at them head on. And so we're just seeing mainly these rectangles of the windows and a large rectangle of the building. So we can just limit our drawing. We can keep it very minimal. We can just draw the part of the building that is very head on and sort of basic. Okay, we don't need to put that perspective in there. It's a choice to put things in there like this. Like I could just leave off these railings and just draw the trees. Okay, so that is one trick for you to do. There is some 3-point perspective in these images as well, because I wanted to make sure that I had some 3-point perspective included when I taught this, when I took these images for the, for the more advanced folks in the class, and for those of you who feel like you can handle it. What's happening here is we've got 3-point perspective because our vertical lines no longer appear straight. They also appear to angle towards a third vanishing point in the sky. And again, there's a class on 3-point perspective studies that I did a couple years ago that you can refer back to, and you could use one of these images, print it out, draw on top of it, and go through the step-by-step process in that particular class to apply the linear perspective sketch to this. Or we can just eyeball it, y'all. We can just draw it loosely based on what we see. We can just use our eyes, and we can trust our eyes, just like we just did when we did the blind contour sketching. And we're going to just do some sketching and embrace some wonkiness here. So if a mistake happens, which is a term that I struggle with, the term mistake, because what is a mistake, right? It's an unintentional mark. You didn't intend to make it. And I made plenty of them while doing this sketch. What you can do is leave it alone and just power through. Let it be wonky. There are definitely some mistakes that I made, some unintentional marks that I made when sketching this part of the villa. There was definitely a moment right here where I got a little lost trying to limit the perspective and leave certain things out. And I just left it alone and didn't worry about it. And I'm going to add some watercolor to it and hopefully camouflage those issues when we get to the watercolor tips and tricks here. Or you can just choose one of the images that doesn't have a lot of perspective in it, like the flowers. You could zoom in on the flowers. You could focus more on the nature aspect here. And maybe that doesn't make it urban sketching if there's not an urban structure in it, but honestly, who cares, right? If you're happy and that's what you're satisfied with doing, I included plenty of pictures here of details. Like, I mean, there's definitely some linear perspective there, but things like interesting trees and planters and things like that. So you could always focus on the aspect of these things that don't have as much linear perspective happening. Okay, so let me find one such image to work from here to do some sketching, and I'm going to use my pen only. You use your pencil first if that scares you to draw in pen only, but honestly, the reason that that scares people is, again, this fear of not making perfect art or making a mistake. And if we're embracing wonkiness here, then that's okay if that happens. Okay, so I'm going to look at one of my more landscapey images here and just start to sketch with my pen only. And I'm looking for just like a basic outline here. I'm keeping it nice and loose. Maybe I even look away a little bit while I'm on this tree, and I'm just going to look away and do a little bit more of like a blind contour thing because I like how that makes my lines a little more loose and carefree when I don't look directly at my paper or when I look away and then look back. So kind of a half blind way of sketching, and that's going to keep my lines a little more loose and free and scribbly and organic. Okay, and then when it comes to the building here, so typically you want to draw from your background forward, but when we're sketching in pen only, it's nice to think about what's in front first, because then you don't have lines that are going through something in the foreground. And if even the talk about foreground, middle ground, and background is going over your head, that's that class on perspective studies that I had a couple years ago could help you with that. I'm trying to keep it pretty basic here. But for the building itself, I can't really see the side of the building too much behind this little planter thing here. And I'm not really worried about things being exactly where they're supposed to be. I'm trying to get just the main idea here. So a little bit more of a cartoonish or illustrative interpretation of these doors and windows, just letting them be basic little rectangles or squares and boxes. We're just really not holding ourselves to perfection here. We're trying to be loose and have fun. And the people who tend to get the most out of these classes that I teach on urban sketching in person, where I get to really see people's process, are the people who are really just embracing the loose freedom of this practice and not trying to make it perfect. But I totally get that perfectionism thing that we can often cling to. Okay, so we want to look for things that are nice and dark. Where are those big shadowy shapes? Where are those prominent horizontal lines and vertical lines that should be included? And like, I'm going to take my own advice here and just leave out that railing because I didn't quite give myself enough space for it. So instead, I'm going to look at these shadows that I'm seeing falling across the ground and focus more on those. And then maybe some of these little light posts in the background, but I'm going to make them 3 different sizes. I'm going to do my artist interpretation of those lamp posts, make them a little more interesting to me. Okay, so that's a pretty good little basis for an urban sketch. It's just the general idea of what I'm seeing in that image. And I really took the linear perspective out and focused more on the light and just the basic vertical and horizontal shapes. Maybe I'll get some of these bricks in here too. But I'm not even looking at the bricks. I'm trying to make them perfect. I want them to be a little imperfect and just general idea of bricks there. All right, let's move on to another. Oh, wait, I wanted to put those that little string of lights in there because that's just a fun detail. Keeping them real loose. And my little artist interpretation of these things. Now I'm going to do one that does have a little bit of 1 point perspective in it, but again, I'm going to give you another trick here for how we can not hold ourselves to perfection. So we talked about those strong vertical lines and horizontal lines. So one strong vertical line in this particular image would be the vertical on the corner on the side of the building there, and then this vertical line of the little drain there as well. And then we've got this orthogonal line that's going to a vanishing point over here. And then we've got these orthogonal lines that are going to our same vanishing point. The string of lights are all going to that same vanishing point. But instead of finding the vanishing point and making it more of a technical drawing, what I'm going to do is just look at the frame of this image. And if you were drawing in person out in the open air, what you could do is hold your thumb up with your pen or your pencil, and I'm going to switch to my forward facing camera here for just a second. Whoops, I turned my camera off. You could hold your thumb up and close one eye and eyeball and find where those vertical lines are so that you can do this in person. But here in the photograph, I can see this diagonal line comes in just about an inch over from the corner. So, and then I can see where these lines are in relationship to the corner of the image as well. So I can look at my little frame that I created here and think about where that line would come in reference to my frame and just start sketching it based on that. And I'm really just eyeballing it. I'm just keeping it real loose here and noticing where the straight lines are, where the diagonal lines are. And if it gets wonky, I'm gonna just live with it. And I'm gonna try to just sketch it based on what I'm seeing there. And I do happen to have a lot of experience with linear perspective, so maybe that's a little bit easier said than done, easier for me to do than it might be easier for you to do. But try it, see what happens. You might surprise yourself. A lot of the expertise that I seem to have acquired in my career came from just trying stuff and doing it. And I feel like I've instilled that in my kids. My daughter is always coming up with ideas for art projects that she's never done before. She just does them. She doesn't wait for somebody to show her how to do it. She just dives right in. And you can often surprise yourself that way. So I'm looking at these palm trees and sketching those in because those are really interesting. Looking for this line of trees back here. And I've had lots of classes on drawing trees that you could search if you wanted, or the main idea from those is look for this little heart rate monitor line for the top of the line of trees and put that in the overall shape of the trees versus trying to draw every detail or anything there. And then anything that you put in, look for if there's a shadow falling across the ground. And I'm editing out quite a bit. I'm kind of imagining the shadows under the trees there since there's actually something blocking those in the photograph. But I want to put them in more of an imagined way right here. And I'm just going to keep it real loose. I'm editing out some things in the photo and I'm looking more for those light shapes and those basic shapes. Those strong vertical lines, those strong horizontal lines. I'm looking away and doing kind of a blind contour thing if I feel like I'm getting too technical. I'm trying to keep it real loose here. Okay, so one thing about 1-point perspective is that if there are doors and windows on the side of a building, the tops and bottoms of those windows are going to follow the orthogonal path of those orthogonal lines. But the main idea we want to look for is where do they become more straight and where do they continue to angle? So the bottom of this window here is actually a little bit more straight, and the top of the window has a bit of a diagonal on it, and then the top of the windows at the top here, these top floor windows, they have a very strong angle on them, like the top of the building. So we just want to make sure that the windows at the top have an angle down, just like the ones at the top of the building, and that the windows on the bottom are a little more straight since they're close to the horizon line. And then these will have a slight angle to them. And if you're like, wait, what are you talking about? Again, I have that 1-point perspective studies class that you can look up, and it'll walk you through step-by-step process of drawing a building using 1-point perspective. But if you can get by with these abbreviated sketching tips, then why not just go for it? Okay, so we're leaving it real loose and empty here. We're giving ourselves lots of fun stuff to splash some watercolor into, and we're going to keep sketching for about 12 to 15 more minutes, and then we're going to move on to the watercolor tips and tricks here. So far we've got a lot of fun tools to put in our tool belts. We've got some fun layout tips and tricks. We've got some tips for loosening up with those blind contours. And then now we've got some easy ways to limit the perspective and not get too bogged down on it. I am going to put that string of lights in there again though, because I like that string of lights. Oops, sorry, I just bumped my camera. I think we have time to do a couple more of these. Do the one with the echinacea flowers again, because that's a fun one. So typically I would advise sketching from the background and working your way forward, but since I'm going in and pen first, it's good to look at what's in front so that you don't have any weird lines that are going through where something is overlapping. And I'm looking more at the shapes of the shadows and the shapes of the light on these flowers and these really prominent lines of the stalks or petal shapes. And the echinaceas have such fun shapes that they make. When they're dying, they turn into these little gumdrop shapes, or like cones. When they first bloom, they have that more a flat look to them. Oh, and that's asking which one am I drawing? This one with the flowers, the one that's zoomed in on the flowers. Jan is saying we don't have the same pictures. Okay, well then use the pictures that you have. I believe I'm recalling now when I tried to attach this huge document, it was a little too much for the Michael's website form where I was including the images. I've never tried to attach such a large file before. There were so many images, so I had to take some out. So, but there's plenty there, and you can use whichever ones. They don't have to be the exact same ones that I'm using. The idea is that you can take these tips and tricks that we're doing here and you can apply them to your own practice out in the world, doing some urban sketching. I'm gonna try not to aim for perfection here tonight either. So it's okay if your drawing is different than my drawing. Okay, so again, I'm looking for these shadows on the ground. All of these prominent shadows and shapes of light are going to give me something fun to splash some watercolor in. And then for the background here, I'm going to really do that blind contour thing. I'm looking away from my drawing now. I'm just glancing down to make sure I'm not going outside of the frame, but I'm going to keep it real loose. Maybe I want those vertical lines from the palm trees in there, but I want it to be like an out of focus scene in the background. So I'm going to keep it real loose in the background. Okay, you want to make sure that I give y'all at least one very concrete drawing tip tonight. I know a lot of these are very cursory things here, and I said we would keep sketching for 12 to 15 more minutes. So with that time, instead of doing one more sketch that you feel like you have to follow along and draw the same thing as me, let me give you a helpful tip for drawing trees. This is something we talked about a lot this summer as we were drawing eyes, nose, and lips in a series that I did from June, July, and just last week we drew lips together. And I talked about the three-dimensional forms of the eyes, nose, and lips, and how maybe we're seeing cones, maybe we're seeing cylinders. So when we're looking at a tree, we're seeing a cylinder, right? We're seeing oh my God, the tree shape is, it's a big wonky cylinder. It's not a perfect cylinder. But depending on where your eye level is, you're going to see the contours of that cylinder, the contour lines, the elevational lines of that cylinder are going to curve in different directions. So let's say our eye line is right in the center of the tree, like this example here. It's the last one. It should be in the document that I shared with you, because when I was deleting them, I'm pretty certain that I made sure that I left this one in there. So when I'm looking at this tree, my eye line, the viewer's eye line, is right about here. So if I were looking up at the tree, then I would see more of like this horizontal curve in an upward direction on the tree there. And then if I was looking down, I would see this downward curve to the horizontal contour lines on the tree. So pay attention to that. And then those same elevational lines are going to be applied to any elevation that we're looking at when it comes to this urban sketching. Hang on, I'm looking for another example in my sketchbook. I want to flip through real quick. That will be helpful for us in talking about this. And oh my gosh, give me 1 second. I thought I labeled it with a post-it. Okay, here we go. So in a typical composition framed with a rectangle, we've got the golden ratio applied, thinking about the rule of thirds. So if we divide the rectangle into thirds on the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, you might think of a frame like this. And a lot of these photographs that I took with the golden ratio in mind, having the horizon line dropped down to the bottom line of the bottom thirds or raised up to the line of the top thirds. I tried to put interesting things where these points intersect. So like the echinacea flower head that your eye really goes to might be showing up right around here in the image where those lines might intersect. Okay, and then if we think about those contour lines that I just used to describe the tree trunk, we can apply that same thing to the elevation that we're seeing throughout the urban sketching landscape. And let me find the reference photo that I was looking at when I drew this here. So looking at this one, this particular photo, and that's fine if this one's not included in the document for you to draw. I just want to show you an example of looking at the contour lines here. So when I'm thinking about this mass of trees in the distance, rather than thinking of each individual branch or leaf or anything, I'm lumping the whole thing into a mass, right? So it's like a big bulbous organic shape. And then I'm looking for the light shapes and the shadow shapes. Like there's this big shadow falling across here, but there's a big shadow back here in the background as well. So you might sketch in a little, off to the side in your sketchbook or to warm up. This could be part of your practice here, is looking for the elevational shift that's occurring. And if you understand the linear perspective, then you might draw in these more linear perspective lines that are showing what's happening to the elevation here, where it's more flat across the sidewalk and where there's some 1 point perspective happening on either side of this walkway. And then on the side of this hill, we've got this increase in elevation on the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. So it's curved around the side of the hill, but it's not perfectly curved. It dips, there's an indentation. It feels a little wavy in some spots, but just notice that and notice those elevational shifts. That's also going to help us when we're adding our watercolor, if you have this understanding of this elevational shift. And then if you make your shadow shapes follow these elevational shifts, that's going to help as well. So having the shadow falling across the sidewalk here, or this path, follow the same flat contour of the elevation that we're seeing there. It's very flat, so we want it to be falling across these straight lines, as opposed to if we have a shadow, let's just say there was a shadow falling across this hill, it would follow more of a curve across the hill, right? There's actually not a shadow on this hill, but if I were to put one, we would want it to follow that same elevational curve that the hill is following. Okay, I don't want to bombard y'all with too much technical stuff here though. So that is it for the drawing tips here. And hopefully that's enough to get you some nice sketches going. I am seeing a really nice one that somebody dropped in the chat. Pallavi has a lovely sketch of those echinacea flowers. Yeah, thank you, lawn trunk. I don't know why I was having a hard time thinking of the word trunk for a second there. That was ridiculous. Oh my God. Such a tree worshiper. And then I just blanked on such a basic word there. A lot going on in the brain these days. All right, let's get our watercolors out and we're going to do some fun splashy stuff with our watercolors for our last 30 minutes of the class here. And you are welcome to continue adding to this so that you fill out your layout more than I did here. I knew with this class I would be lucky if I got even 50% of what was in this example, which I tried to leave unfinished on purpose. But I think I got more than half, of those boxes filled in. So I'm in a good spot. Okay, so without going too much into watercolor techniques, because that's coming up in a couple weeks, right? In September, we've got those classes on watercolor techniques, which I've already, who knows what I did with those examples, but I showed them to you at the start of the class. We're going to keep it really basic with the watercolor techniques tonight. And so what we're going to do is make some very thin puddles of paint. We're going to make some washes. So I'm going to clean out I did not clean this very well the last time I used it. I'm just going to get it wet with my paintbrush and wipe it out with my paper towel real quick here. And then we're going to make some puddles of paint, some washes to use here. And you can make them more realistic to what you're seeing in the photograph if you'd like, or you can play around with some unrealistic color, or you can take these tips on how to just take some basic colors and make them a little more earthy. So let me move my drawing aside for a second here. And I've got a steep angle on my desk, so I always have to fight with that a little bit. I'm going to take my water cup and my water, and I'm going to just start dripping water onto my palette here. And because of the angle of my desk, it is sliding down to the bottom there. You could use a paint palette if you want, if you've got like a plastic palette with some wells in it, and you could fill those up with some different little puddles of water. Okay, and then let's just take our blues and our greens, because we've all got some blue sky and some green trees in some of these. So first we're going to make just a nice little thin puddle of blue for one of our skies. But I don't want my sky to be too perfect. I want it to not feel, oh geez. Maybe I should actually grab a palette instead of doing this here. Give me 1 second. I always forget about this angle on my desk. Okay, so start over here. I only recently got this new drafting table, and are new to me, and I set it up on more of an incline than my old desk, and I just keep forgetting that will happen. All right, so I'm dripping water into these wells, getting them nice and puddly. The key word in watercolor is water, and oftentimes folks just do not use enough water when they're making their washes. Sometimes I even have pipettes on my desk, a little eyedropper that I use to get those puddles to happen really quickly, but took them away. I'm just taking my paintbrush and just dripping it from the water in the water cup so that I can get a nice thin puddle to happen. But like I said, I don't want my color, or I was starting to say, I don't want my colors to be too straight out of the palette. I want them to feel a little muted, a little more earthy. So for the sky, to make it feel a little more muted, I can just add a touch of black or gray to it. And that was actually my purple, not my gray. So I'll take my black here and water that down a little bit so that it's not too strong. And then add that to my blue. I could also try combining a couple of different blues. So make a puddle of that blue and then combine it with this blue. You know, just play around with your blue a little bit, maybe add some gray to it to tone it down. And then same thing with our green, only instead of adding gray to it, we're going to take our greens, make a couple of different greens here. And they might just look a little too perfect somehow out of the tray there. So you might add maybe a little yellow, give it more of a dimension. Brighten it up a little bit. Or you might add a little brown. Make it a little more rustic, a little more earthy. So I'm going to make one with a dark brown, my darker greens. Might even start to look almost black when it's super saturated there, but when it's thinned out, it will definitely look more like a dark green. And then let me do one that's sort of in the middle here. So I just took that brown and then just added this lighter green to it. So it just tones it down a little bit, mutes it so that it doesn't feel too cartoonish. And that one might still be a little too, no, I want one that's a little bright like that. Okay. Let's see. And then, yeah, on the trees, rather than using brown on the trees, maybe on some of the trees, you might want to use gray. Because in some of these reference photos, I feel like the trees actually do show up looking a little more gray. And then in the shadows on the trees, you might use more of a blue, a dark blue, instead of brown or black. And again, that's just going to give it a little bit more interest. Or you could play around with using some really fun, unrealistic colors, some really bright colors, you know, purples and oranges, blues and orange, you know, nice, bright, unrealistic colors, maybe some neon reds and pinks and purples, you know, feel free to be playful and let things be unrealistic as well. But I wanted to make a watered down gray here for my trees. And I'm going to add a little blue to that. Maybe let me make a blue and then add gray to it. I already have my other blues on here. Okay, so that ought to be nice for the trees. Okay, let's see. And then maybe I did have those echinacea flowers in there. So maybe I'll make a little pink to splash into those, some pinks and purples. And I can do those as I go. All right, so let's get to these quick and easy watercolor tips. So the first one is what I just shared with you, is how to make a quick little palette of colors that are not too complicated, but also give it a little more of an earthy, toned down feeling. if we're going for a little more realism. Okay, so I teach a lot of watercolor classes and a lot of water media classes, and the number one tip or the number one rule for watercolor that I really try to drive home with folks is you have to traditionally, you want to paint one layer at a time and you want to let each layer completely dry before you move on to the next layer. But since we're doing these quick little things that we can do in maybe 30 minutes while drawing outside on our lunch break, then we want to do some things that we don't have to necessarily wait for each layer to dry. So what we're going to do is we're going to make gaps. We're going to leave a gap in between our colors. So what that means is, and it may be kind of hard to tell that I did it here, but I left a little, let me get it really close to the camera. I painted right up to the edge of where the tree was going to go, and then I stopped. I kept it real loose and splashy. I didn't quite go to the edge of the tree in all the places so that I leave a little gap. And that way, if I don't touch my colors to each other, I can get multiple layers in there before each layer dries. So let me demonstrate that. We've actually done that before in another class. It's so hard not to reference back so many previous classes when I know I've covered things before. Don't feel like you have to have attended all these other classes. I'm just saying if you want another class that covers that maybe in more depth. There was one on fall leaves last year, fall leaves, and we did the same thing. We left a gap in between our background and our foreground on those leaves so that we could do it quickly. Okay, so I'm going to take this blue from my sky, and I'm just going to glance at the photo. I'm not going to stay too true to the photo here. And it's gonna, since this is nice and thinned out, oh, I got a little weird hair in there. We've got a nice thin wash, which is a good thing to do. So I'm leaving a little gap between where the building is. I'm just going right up next to it. And same thing with the trees. I'm going quickly, spreading this blue around. And I'm going to just not worry about the clouds. I'm going to pretend there's no clouds. And I'm being okay with it if it goes a little outside of my lines there. But where I get next to the building or the trees, I just went around them. I went right up to the edge and then I stopped. And I might fill in some of these keyholes, but I'm being very strategic to not touch them at the edge of those lines, because then I don't have to wait for my sky to dry before I add something to the trees or the building here. So now I can go straight to my green colors. Just get this a little more framed in the center of the camera. Okay, so I'm going to go with this lighter green first into the trees, into kind of the middle part of the trees. And I'll go ahead and splash that in where I see it on the grass. And again, I'm just leaving a little gap in between, keeping it real loose. And then I can go back in with my darker green across that tree line. And where it might have touched the blue sky, if I had gone all the way to the edge, it shouldn't be doing that now because I'm leaving a gap. So it's not bleeding into the blue sky. If I had gone right up to the edge, then that would be happening. And I wanted this to be that light green across the grass, that bright green. Like, see, that bright green is now bleeding into the dark green a little bit there. But that's okay. If it does bleed on your end, that's fine. It'll just add to the whimsical nature of what we're going for here with these. So don't be hard on yourself if your colors are bleeding despite your best efforts to keep them a little separated here. So that is kind of the main tip, is keep it really thin and washy. Mind the gap, leave a little gap there, and that will allow you to fill things in nice and quick. Now I'm going to maybe even jump to one of these other ones before things get a little too wet on there. Let me go back up to my other reference photo here and see where these same colors could be filled in my other example. So I had my darker green right here, and then back here on these trees. So I'm just trying to leave a little gap, leaving some space in between all the things. And you can always go back in and add another layer to stuff. And I have one more tip I'm going to add in just a second, basically just using the watercolor more directly to draw with the more high contrasty watercolor. But first we're just filling in these loosey-goosey washes. And I'm jumping around to all these different images. And while I've got this dark green on my paintbrush, just splashing it in there, real wet and loose. So this is just like that blind contour thing keeps us loose, jumping around like this and leaving a little gap and keeping it nice and wet. That's also going to keep it loose. Now I'll use my dark gray that I made to splash in my tree trunks. Maybe I could go over this with another layer of brown. But for now, I'm just filling it in with gray. And then while I have the gray on my brush, I might fill in some of these shadows that are falling across the ground, or maybe go ahead and put a base layer inside of these windows. And that might be all that you want. Maybe just a little thin wash like this is all that you want, especially if you have a lot of detail in your sketch. You maybe don't want to put too much watercolor, and just these thin washes sometimes are enough to, get the job done. The job being creating a satisfying urban sketch. So whenever you're satisfied, you did it. Okay, but let's say that you do want some more high contrasty stuff to happen here, or you want something that's going to create more of like a wow impact with your watercolor. Then get my screen out of the way. I feel like it's messing with how my colors are showing up. So I'm going to take that liner brush and I'm going to take my black and add it to this blue, or maybe add some brown to it, just something to give this black a little bit more dimension. You can use just the black directly from your set as well. So I want to go in with this more direct watercolor, so I didn't add a whole lot of water to it. And I want to kind of draw with it a little bit into these areas where I'm seeing some really dark shadows. And again, I'm minding that little gap, letting there be a gap, because that's just going to add to the whimsical nature of the way we're painting here. Keep it nice and loose and give me the ability to maybe add another layer in some places. But like letting it bleed on purpose can be nice too. So I just added the shadow to the bottom of this bush and I'm letting it bleed into that green because I kind of want it to bleed right there. So you can play around with that, letting it bleed where you might want it to bleed, but using it more directly like this is going to create some really high contrast. It's going to make some stuff stand out. So I'm just noticing where I had some really strong shadows that went all the way to black, like in the windows or underneath this little staircase here. And that's going to create that really high contrasted visual impact. And I'm just going to use that liner brush to jump around and maybe draw a little bit with it. Draw into the tree line. And it is bleeding a little bit, but maybe that's okay. You know, you can always stop here and pause or go to a different one if it's bleeding too much. Because actually I'm like, at first I kind of liked how it was bleeding, but now it's bleeding a little too much. But for me right now in this moment, but I can let that dry. It's not going to be as, it's always going to look different wet versus when it's dry. So, but I can even use this to add like these little, I could do this with my pen too, but where it stands out really black on that string of lights. One of them bled right there, so I'm going to stop that. But all right, y'all get the idea. Okay. And I wanted to make sure I put some pinks and purples on these flowers to create some fun color contrast here. So just going to water down one of my reds to make a pink. Maybe I'll add a little white to it because I happen to have white in this set. And then have a little purple over here as well. So I've got my pink and my purple. And I can do the same little push and pull with the splashy watercolor here. So versus more direct. So maybe with the dark purple, I go in and put all these little dark purple details at the tips of my flowers. And then in a perfect world, I would wait for that to dry before I splashed in the pink. Well, let's see what happens if I go ahead and splash in the pink and let them bleed together. That might be kind of fun. Okay, yeah. So that is pretty much it, y'all. I think that is enough to jumpstart anybody's urban sketching practice. And then, yeah, once you've got these layers that are dry, you can, oh no, I just let all that bleed. But see, that's kind of fun where that just all bled together. Maybe I'll leave that alone. And things look so different dry when they're wet, wet versus dry. So if you don't like it, you can grab a paper towel and pull it out of there if something bleeds too much while you're splashing things in and they accidentally touch. And if you don't have enough of a gap between them, it can be fun to let them bleed together, or you can just paint one layer at a time and let it dry and then wait for it to dry and then do another layer. That's the easiest way to have control. And I'll talk about all that more in the watercolor techniques class that's coming up in September. I'm just going to add a little bit more to one of these echinacea flowers. We'll put a little brown on there and then a little orange and let it bleed together. Oh, it bled into that background. Okay, time to stop. When that starts happening too much, that's when you want to just let it dry and then go back in. Okay. That was some good feedback from Julie. Thank you. Does anybody want to hold up their work and we can spotlight you and see what you did in tonight's class? If it's super wet, then don't pick it up because then it's gonna bleed. Oh, that's beautiful, Sarah. Yes, I love how you really got the 3 dimensions of that tree in there very nicely, and the perspective on the deck. Very impressive. Yeah. All right, look at that. Oh, beautiful. Yes. Oh, and it looks like you've got some like a little Adirondack chair and some stuff of your own there. I don't recognize that from the photos. That's lovely. Oh, look at this. This is Barbara's. Beautiful work. Yes. Oh, I just love how splashy and whimsical that is, Barbara. That's so nice. That's exactly what we're looking for. Oh, look at these fun colors, Joey. I love it. Yeah, this technique really lends itself to like children's book illustrations, doesn't it? That feels like a children's book illustration to me. This is Kenny. Oh, wow, Kenny, that's beautiful. Oh my gosh, I'm so impressed. Really wonderful work. And there's Arthur. Nice to see you, Arthur. Yes. Oh, I love that you challenged yourself with that 2-point perspective image and you got all those details in that other one. That's really lovely. Yeah, that looks like a children's book illustration. I'm loving it. Oh, these are so nice. Yes. Oh, I love that. Relax your mind and draw. And I love your little rounded squares that you used as a frame on that one. Yeah. I love the perspective on all of those, just that whimsical thing that's happening. Really nice work, y'all. Oh, that makes me so proud. I'm so happy. Please feel free to send any of these to me in an email or in a message on Facebook or Instagram, or if you want to tag your work with those hashtags, Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes, and then please tag me at Adrienne Hodge Art on Instagram so that I can see them. And I'd love to share these with my in-person students as well. It's always so nice to see student examples. It's like they see my examples and they're like, oh, well, you already know how to do this. But then they see a student example and they're like, oh, yes, I can do this too. So it's always so nice to have those student examples. Please share them with me. And this is one of my biggest passions, one of my favorite things to do, right up there with life drawing is urban sketching. It's so fun. All right. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Ilse, for being such a great moderator again. And y'all have a wonderful rest of your evening.